If you're trying to resist temptation, you may find yourself feeling the forbidden desires more strongly just when your ability to resist them is down. Ego depletion thus creates a double whammy. Your willpower is diminished and your cravings feel stronger than ever. Baumeister and Tierney. Strength does not come from physical capacity, it comes from an indomitable will. Mahatma Gandhi. Nothing can withstand the power of the human will if it is willing to stake its very existence to the extent of its purpose. Benjamin Disraeli. Hello and welcome to the Emil Barna podcast, where today I'll be reading chapter 3 of my book on addiction and willpower. This chapter is entitled Discipline, where we'll be delving into the types of things that we've spoken about so far around addiction, the mechanics of addiction, willpower, what that means, and how to bring it into a disciplined goal. Now, these days, we've got a whole range of discussion around discipline equals freedom, to use Jocko Willink's term, the retired US Navy SEAL and leadership extravagant. This guy has a whole range of interesting tidbits on discipline and freedom. I'll be borrowing some of these, but also making them my own with my clinical practice, my psychotherapeutic experience, and trying to make practical what discipline actually looks like when it comes to addiction recovery. So sit back, relax, or do whatever it is that you do when you're listening to stuff, and we'll get right on into it. Let's go back to the book. This chapter is all about pulling threads and discussing willpower as it relates to addiction. How exactly do self-control, blood glucose levels, and self-regulation relate to drugs and alcohol, or addiction in general? But even more important, what can we do about it? To answer this, we're going to turn to discipline. Addiction and willpower. As I sit across from a client of mine who's been referred to my office given a mandate from the justice system, I'm usually trying to gauge what they're expecting from coming to counselling. Most come because it's a court requirement and nothing else. Some start off that way but have a change of heart and actually begin to enjoy counselling. Others want to dig in straight away, and they're really sick of where they've been and all the stuff that they've done that have led them to that point. They don't want to see another stranger and kind of go through the ins and outs of their life. These people begin to want to change. I've got to say that expectations play a huge role in therapy. What influences a person's readiness is often their past. When I treat someone with an addiction, I want to know how many times they've tried to quit, the longest they've gone without using, the circumstances leading to lapse and relapse. Some are able to quit out of pure grit and determination. Others believe they've really never had a problem, so it was pretty easy for them to let go for some time. But then they slowly and sneakily get back into the substance of their choice. Then there are those who laud the services that have helped them out in the past, as well as the family and friends that led them there. These guys found these services to be incredibly important to help them get to the place that they are right then. And perhaps need to hone in on a few other things that they'd like to work out. So they rest on the shoulders of the things that they've done before. One thing to remember is that a person's utilization of anything up until that point that they come across the room to you, or if you're reading this and listening to this and noticing that you're the person that's coming to a service, the best thing to notice in yourself is what's happened before. There's also something else that's really important and that I want to focus on in this book: the concept of free will. A brief on free will. When the late journalist and writer Christopher Hitchens was asked whether people have free will, his response was, "Yes, I have free will. I have no choice but to have it." Many in the addictions field discuss this concept of choice in substance use. Ultimately, people choose to use a substance. In fact, I would say that therapy cannot continue until this requisite is established. After all, there's no pistol pressed against your forehead barking the order to use a drug. To put it bluntly, that's what's going on. For most people, in their minds, they think that they are compelled to do something. Most do so out of their own choice. Now, I've got to be quite nuanced here because I am a therapist and I work in nuance. But there's no disagreement that choice is a factor. Most people inherently agree with this. In my clinical practice, I've yet to meet somebody who has denied that they had a choice in the matter. On the contrary, people who use are quite determined in planning how to ration their portions and deciding when to use, especially if low on cash. They paradoxically, you might say, exercise discipline in order to get the most out of their high. So, how to understand willpower in the midst of all this? How can you stop drinking or using drugs if that's your goal? If you've done so in the past, why not now? And, well, this is what we're here for. This is what this chapter is all about. I want to have a bit of a rundown on how we might go about this. And first, I want to bring in a concept that Baumeister and his colleagues termed quite a while back. This concept is ego depletion. You might have heard about it in the introduction to this chapter earlier on. Let's get into that. Ego depletion. Baumeister and his colleagues coined the term ego depletion in 1998 to describe people's diminished capacity to regulate their thoughts, feelings, and actions. Put simply, it's the difficulty to control yourself in a particular task if you've already spent some energy doing something else before. Think of a person who finds it hard to resist taking a joint when it's passed around the group because he's spent a lot of energy fighting with his girlfriend earlier. This is ego depletion in action. You can pretty much apply this to anything that you've spent quite a lot of time doing before you're required to do something else that requires, again, another word, requires a type of focus, intense focus. So if you spend a lot of time working out just before you had to go ahead and do a difficult test, you're going to find yourself depleted of energy. Baumeister and his colleagues said that we all draw from the same common energy source, and once this energy source has been depleted, the less energy you have for a future task. Baumeister's research has found that in initial act of self-control impaired subsequent self-control, that making a responsible decision impaired subsequent self-control, that self-control lowered performance on another task that required self-control, and that an initial act of self-control led to increased passivity. In layman's terms, they found that once you use energy on one task, you have less energy for another. You might try to perform, but your effort pales in comparison to what you're usually able to do. This can lead you to feeling passive, deflated, unmotivated, and even depressed. Ego depletion is often at its fullest in the throes of withdrawal, colloquially known as the come down. So much effort is going into breaking the addiction that you're burning through whatever energy you might have. Cravings intensify and self-control plummets. Let me give you a bit of an example of how this might look like therapeutically. I'm sitting across from George, an unkempt 30-year-old man with a receding hairline and wearing loose-fitting trackies with a stained t-shirt. He's in the throes of an intense wave of craving. On the verge of a lapse, he is sweating profusely. His thighs and hands are shaking, and he avoids eye contact, fidgeting from one side to another. Without a drink for about 2 weeks, he's only just hanging on. He had recently been discharged from hospital for treatment for pancreatitis, brought on by excessive alcohol consumption. It was the most intense pain I'd ever experienced, he says. I need to quit. As a novice therapist, I asked him about his personal strengths, how long he'd gone without a drink, and even practiced a few breathing exercises with him before chatting about the concept of willpower. I remind him that it's up to him whether he drinks or not, and that he was strong enough to take that route if he chose to. The session ended and he thanked me for my support. 2 weeks later, he'd lapsed following an argument with his spouse. He said that he'd had a few drinks, but nowhere near as much as he'd been drinking before. He also said that he'd remembered the metaphor I'd used in the previous session about his being a stronghold at siege, the enemy surrounding him. Was he able to keep up the fight? Would he become victorious? For George, understanding the concept of willpower was beneficial. The more I spoke with him about it, the more hope he had. Far from discussion about willpower being a drag in treatment, it served as a bolster towards higher levels of self-confidence. For George, acute stress hijacked his brain's ability to metabolize the appropriate amount of glucose to function. Well, that's one way you can consider it. In fact, that's the way that ego depletion is conceptualized through Baumeister and his colleagues' research. In general, substance use reorients the brain's chemistry, thus impairing decision-making and overall function. There's a lot that could be said about this, but I don't have the time nor the experience to expound this fully, because more and more people much smarter than me from a neuropsychological and neurochemical bent have done this before. In my clinical practice, and that's what I can do, speak clinically, I found that educating my clients on what they can do to take charge of their own biology has been incredibly empowering. This was the approach I took with George, and it paid off. He went on to take charge of his drinking, later quitting alcohol and securing employment. Teaching my clients about the brain and how they can harness its strength is, I believe, one of the most powerful gifts I can offer. Ego depletion comes and goes. The real task is, and will continue to be, preparing for it. Willpower and substance use. Now that we've established blood glucose is pivotal to the distribution of energy around the body, it's important to note that not all substances are created equal. Thus, do not each have an identical effect on blood glucose. There's no contest to the fact that alcohol leads to decreased glucose in the body, therefore affecting the brain's ability to self-regulate. But this is just one factor among many. Alcohol use also has an inhibitory effect on glutamate, and this is a neurotransmitter involved in learning and memory formation in the brain. It can therefore reduce self-control, increase impulsive behavior, and slow down brain activity. All of this can ensure a regrettable night, day, or life if it's enough of an issue. But what about cannabis, methamphetamine, cocaine? What about other drugs? What are the effects here? Let's find out. Downers, also known as tranquilizers. Substances like alcohol, heroin, methadone, and benzodiazepines, for example, some sleeping pills, anxiety medications, and withdrawal pills, fall into this category. Downers act as nervous system depressants, helping the body relax. A depressant in this context doesn't mean depression, but rather a type of medication that reduces communication between the brain and the body. You might use these drugs to escape the stresses of everyday life or just to chill out. In terms of glucose metabolism, people using heroin and methadone experience an impaired insulin response, leading to impaired glucose metabolism. This isn't good for diabetics who might be experiencing problems with insulin. Generally, adding heroin, methadone only compounds this. With regards to benzodiazepines, one study found that impaired glucose tolerance after use was a factor, thus increasing the risk of hyperglycemia, which means increased blood glucose levels. But how does any of this relate to energy and willpower? Well, depressants impact glucose metabolism, thus affecting energy distribution around the brain and the body. This can lead to heightened emotionality, less self-control, less consequential thinking, and higher impulsivity, all prerequisites to substance use. Uppers. An upper is slang for a drug that speeds up or has a stimulating effect on the body. Ecstasy, ice, cocaine, and amphetamines like speed fall into this category. Uppers have a hyperglycemic effect on the body. They lower blood glucose levels rather, so hypoglycemic. This is often because people eat less while taking stimulants. Less food and increased suppression of hunger often lead to increased glucose metabolism. The body's got to get its energy from somewhere. We also see a decrease in appetite. If you don't eat, you can't replenish lost energy supplies. Without energy, your body fails. Not only this, but when you use uppers, you don't get enough sleep. This is a major factor, leading to irritability, lack of focus, impulsivity, lethargy, and less consequential thinking. Hallucinogens. Cannabis in very high doses, psilocybin or psychedelic mushrooms, and lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, fall into this category. Cannabis lowers blood glucose levels and can cause hyperglycemia, given the phenomenal munchies. When you eat more, glucose levels skyrocket, especially when stocking up on junk food. When blood glucose levels are higher than usual, they must come down. This usually occurs after an hour or so, thereby leaving you susceptible to lapses in self-control during that time. When mixing substances, this physiological upset is more pronounced. So what can you do to overcome ego depletion? Well, drug use affects self-control, and as the day wears on, your energy depletes. Can you find a way to overcome this energy depletion? Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience, Caroline Martijn, and her colleagues in the Netherlands seem to think so. Martijn and her colleagues sought to measure energy depletion by testing how participants went as they engaged in a strenuous task. One group of participants were told to hold tightly onto a hand grip until they couldn't do it any longer. After completing their first bout of hand grip exercises, they were provided with articles and images of successful athletes and asked to read motivating statements like, "After serious setbacks and disappointments, don't give up, don't quit. You can do more than you think. I have learned that I can do much more than I thought. You have to go for it." Those are some examples of what happened in the scripts in that study. Upon reading these scripts, they were given a series of labyrinths, which were difficult computer puzzle exercises, to complete before being given another go on the hand grip exercises. Another group were asked to perform the initial hand grip exercise before viewing the same motivating images, statements, and articles as the first group. However, they were not provided with difficult labyrinths to complete before trying their hand at another hand grip exercise. Another group started off the same, except they were not given the motivational material prior to completing difficult labyrinths and subsequent hand grip exercises. A final group was asked to complete the difficult labyrinths first and the hand grip exercises second. The results were as follows. Number 1, those who completed the difficult labyrinths after their initial bout of hand grip exercises performed much better on subsequent hand grip exercises. Those who were not assigned difficult labyrinth exercises but were asked to repeat the hand grips after either coming across the motivating stories or not having been given these stories performed much worse on the hand grips the second time. Essentially, this was ego depletion in reverse. Those who were mentally exhausted performed better. Why is that? Don't people usually perform better when they're energized? This research pointed to something entirely different: the mind's ability to push through under stress. Those who were depleted when looking at the athlete didn't stop to think about the differences between the athlete and themselves. They just took on board what the exemplar was personifying: victory, perseverance, hard work. Those who weren't depleted made the distinction that they and the athlete were not the same. What this research highlighted was that a person's self-concept factors into their willpower strength. Those depleted and wanting victory were more likely to see themselves as exemplary. They wanted to be seen as victors. Thus, they pushed through and persevered. Understanding ego depletion in addiction. Can you overcome it? The addiction as compulsion view states that those hooked on drugs and alcohol can't abstain. Substances beckon them somehow. According to this view, people don't have free will, aren't capable of making good decisions, cannot be trusted. I disagree. Those with an addiction aren't automatons. They, like all others, are responsible for their actions and inactions. They have agency over their own behavior. They have responsibility. One might say that the addiction as disease model, taken too far, usually puts addicts in the same line as those suffering from, say, Alzheimer's. They're both diseases of the brain, aren't they? And thus, they should be treated as such. But if things really got to the crunch, it seems to me that the people would have the highest likelihood to change would be the person who uses. After all, can an elderly lady afflicted with Alzheimer's just snap out of it? Well, neither can a person who uses, but the latter can still choose to overcome rather than remain afflicted. You might get a bit of pushback saying that it's not as simple as saying I'm going to just stop right now. And you'd be right. I mean, it's really important to know that everyone's coming from a different point of view with different life experiences and different things that have happened throughout their lifetimes that have made them choose the things that they've chosen throughout their life. I'm by no means saying that this is an easy process, but to compare it to something like Alzheimer's, which is a disease and affliction of the brain that slowly chews through a person's ability to make any substantive change that is outside of their capacity and their brain's ability, is comparing apples with oranges. You cannot consider addiction, which begins as a voluntary choice and that, yes, does have significant effects on the human brain, as one of a brain disease that is had upon people rather than people having a certain choice within that process. Let's go back to the book. Without the freedom to choose, we're just robots, determined by our surroundings and internal proclivities. It's akin to saying a person with a genetic predisposition towards alcoholism is destined to be an alcoholic. Experience and observation tells us that this is not always the case. Researchers Foddy and Savulescu maintain that addictive behavior is a choice not much different to food addiction, often more degenerative, but a choice nonetheless. People who use drugs and alcohol are capable, no matter how this capacity is mediated by past experiences, stress, how much energy they have in the moment, or how much willpower they have. People are always capable of making a change in their behavior. I want to make a comment on this. This is one of the most uplifting statements I think I could take. You are not what you think, you are not what you feel, you are not what you say, you become what you do. And to sit by and say something like, well, I've got an addiction, it's just what my brain's doing, I've got some sort of a disease, is shirking responsibility, in my opinion. It makes a person less able to take the steps that's necessary to be able to make these real changes. Now, I'm not saying that these changes are easy. I've said it before. These changes take time and they do take effort, but this is the most important and the most revolutionary thing that a person who's struggling with addiction can do, to really step up and say, hey, I think I can put my hand at this. I can take one small step to really move things forward. Back to the book. So what does it take? The neuroethicist Neil Levy highlights how neuroimaging techniques like positron emission tomography, the PET scan, and functional magnetic resonance imaging, the fMRI, reveal the brain areas involved in self-control. These are the anterior cingulate and prefrontal cortex. The anterior cingulate is a part of the brain that helps you control your emotions and make decisions and regulate bodily functions such as blood pressure and heart rate. The prefrontal cortex is like the CEO of the body, the self-perceptive me that evaluates what to direct attention to. The more self-control you use, the higher the need for energy in these brain areas. Kicking a habit requires discipline. It's not all about managing cravings. These fluctuate as the day wears on. Sometimes they're intense, other times negligible. It's often a person's will that predicts whether they use. Willpower tends to wear out as the day progresses and various tasks are performed. Studies investigating how to overcome ego depletion have shown that one must aspire to something greater than oneself. Alcoholics Anonymous or AA meetings direct their attention to a higher purpose or power. That power is often the group or God they worship. At the same time, one must learn how to act in a world without the support of a group. In this case, learning to rely on oneself becomes increasingly important. As you compare yourself to yourself, you get a better picture of what's achievable. Think of somebody who reminds themselves that in the past he was able to kick an addiction for over a year. However, he loses his job, is reminded of a past trauma, and starts to withdraw from his family. He slips. Consider Jeffrey. Jeffrey is a 31-year-old plasterer who lives with his mother, stopped using ice just over a month ago, and with mum's help, managing his finances, Jeffrey is able to reduce his compulsive gambling. After 6 weeks of no drug use, he starts to use again. I counseled Jeffrey at this crossroads in his life. At first, he didn't tell me about his relapse, but as his behavior became a little bit more erratic, he began to talk. I helped him avoid ripping into himself after having a lapse and told him that it was imperative to remind himself of his gains up until that point. If he weren't able to do that, he'd succumb to the what the hell effect, and it would be harder to get back on track. Now keep in mind the what the hell effect is giving up on your entire goal when you fall short prior to reaching it. You throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, what the hell, I was never going to do it anyway. And you tend to convince yourself of the latter rather than reminding yourself of the gains that you've drawn up until that point. Drawing on Baumeister's work, Dr. Neil Levy highlighted that the more we experience cravings, the more we succumb. This is a bit interesting because I said relatively earlier that cravings don't necessitate relapse. It's a person's disciplined action and lack thereof that tend to lean a person more into that crevice of relapse. But let's see what Neil has to say. Neil Levy said that the most successful technique here is simply to turn our attention away from the cues that trigger our desires, identifying triggers and steering clear of them. Now, that's fair enough. It's pretty common sense to say if the more you're closer to something that you'd rather avoid, the simpler it is for you to get touched by that thing. And so the way that Neil Levy discusses this particular process is intuitive. Of course, I mean, we don't want to continually put ourselves in the state of danger. And I think this is where the interplay within addiction and discipline comes in. We need to identify these triggers, steer clear of them, but not just do that. Don't just take something away. Make sure that we are able to devise our life and structure our life in such a way that it makes it a lot more difficult to find that action appealing. The way that I pitch it to my clients is creating a life where it just doesn't make sense for you to use any longer. Neil Levy goes on to discuss brain science. In brain terms, you must utilize your prefrontal cortex to regulate your attention and manage the subcortical firing that leads to an emotional response. Avoiding circumstances that might lead you to use, especially in the early days, can be the difference between avoiding relapse and return to drug use. This is imperative. And I know there are a lot of imperative things that I may be utilizing within this resource, but I would say that many people consider relapse as most volatile within the first 12 weeks after stopping use. You're much more likely to go back to the drug within the first 3 months than afterwards. It's a very interesting correlation there with the way the brain tends to clear out and return to baseline dopamine levels, and you're much more able to feel motivated on your own accord. Now, of course, different drugs have different effects, so some could stay for a little bit longer, these withdrawals and this difficulty to keep on track, and some may be a little bit less. Now, I would always say that structuring your life in such a way that you're not just taking away a substance, but you are installing other habits to make sure that we don't go back to that initial substance. That's what's going on, and that's what we really need to focus in on. Let's go back to the book. Self-awareness. Defined in the previous chapter as the ability to know oneself and one's surroundings, self-awareness is intrinsically linked to self-regulation. In brain terms, organisms with spindle cells, that is, fast communicating cells found in the brains of humans, higher apes such as chimps and bonobos, and even dolphins, can recognize themselves as distinct beings. If they look at themselves in a mirror, they can recognize themselves. In humans, spindle cells communicate through the activation of different parts of the brain, specifically the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, involved in the activation of mirror neurons, which are responsible for the ability to recognize actions with intentions. When these parts of the brain are firing, one outcome is that self-awareness occurs. Social psychologists understand self-awareness as a precursor to action of a particular type. Psychologists talk about one's actual self, ideal self, and ought self. The actual self refers to the person one is now. The ideal self is the person one would like to be. The ought self refers to the person others expect one to be. A transient person using heroin who became homeless after being kicked out of his parents' home has his actual self to look at. This is the self that is homeless and addicted. Often, this is his only vantage point. He cannot even dream of thinking about any other version of himself. But to better himself, he must consider the person he would like to be. Let's say he was an aspiring musician, caught up in the party life. A successful musician might be his ideal self, but he must also consider the self he believes he ought to be, perhaps the person his parents raised him to be. Taken together, these concepts can frame discussion and action. I often ask my clients if they were to forecast the next few years of their life, where would they like to be? Then I ask them if continuing along the path they are on, at the current point, would they get there? The answer is often a unanimous no. However, despite the want to get there, it's often the current self that has them by the throat. One of the better ways to remedy this is to bring the future self closer to the present. The health psychologist Kelly McGonigal maintains that one of the reasons people don't move forward is because the future is foreign to them. They'd rather invest in the present. To combat this, Dr. McGonigal invites one to write their present selves a letter from their future selves to imagine how things would be if current actions were repeated without change. Then to write another letter from the future self back to the present, revealing how things would be when the much needed changes are made. What would the future self say if he went on using drugs? What about if he got clean? How would things turn out then? What does he look like? How old is he? What facial expression does he have? What is he wearing? What car is he driving? With whom is he spending his time? Does he have his driver's license? What job does he have? How much savings does he have in the bank? When was the last time he went on vacation? Specificity is key. Self-regulation. Baumeister and Vinash observed that, quote, self-regulation operates mainly to resist the addictive cravings, and in the long run, presumably with professional help, the addict's regulatory capabilities may enable him or her to break free of the addiction. Close quote. In other words, one must use willpower to overcome cravings, then to onboard others to quit for good. The more support you have, the better. Self-regulation is needed when you're managing urges too. One strategy clinicians often use is called urge surfing. Basically, this encourages people to notice the urges as they arise in the body. Pay attention as they intensify and ride them out until they pass. Denied gratification becomes delayed reward. Practiced often enough, your self-control muscle is strengthened through the laying down of new neural connections. The more you practice, the better you get. A few years back, I was invited to what I later found out was a pyramid scheme held in the backyard of the host's rental property. They were trying to sell health products. They told those in attendance that nutrients are lost through the process of cooking and that their supplements were the answer. If we were serious about our health, we'd invest in their supplements that very night, which, luckily enough, were on discount. The presenter said that although they were speaking out of somebody's backyard that night, it wouldn't always be that way. Just as many multi-billion-dollar businesses started out of a founder's garage, so too does success. Your success. Humble beginnings and all that jazz. If you got involved tonight, you'll get the share in the wealth. It would have been foolish to invest in a scheme that operated in the guise of a real grassroots business at the time. Even though the pitch may have stirred emotions and cultivated FOMO, fear of missing out, self-regulatory processes, not unlike those active in resisting temptation, were duly at work, at least for me. The importance of handling such a situation, therefore, lies in the process of self-awareness. Without self-awareness, regulation is moot. After all, you need to know what you're resisting and why to take appropriate steps forward. As the old saying goes, knowledge is power. Let's look at this clinically. The late psychoanalyst Alan Wheelist wrote The Quest for Identity, which compared psychoanalytic therapy today with analysis practiced a century earlier during Freud's time. He said that Freud's Victorian patients had more willpower and self-discipline due to emphasis on the building of character during that time. They lacked self-awareness though. It was not as highly valued as collective awareness, so that is the awareness within the culture at the time and the expectations placed therein. Freudian psychoanalysis was so effective, therefore, as it broke down the patient's intellectual defenses, enabling them to unveil deeper parts of their psyche and understand why they were the way that they were. Once self-awareness was achieved, they would utilize their ingrained willpower to harness personal fulfillment. Things aren't so cut and dry today, unfortunately. People in the West often achieve self-awareness much quicker than ever before. However, they have much less willpower and discipline to change themselves once they've reached this point. Why is that? Well, one might argue that we have more opportunities to focus on ourselves than ever before. One might even call that narcissism. With social media running rampant in most people's lives, we decide which face the world sees. We also have a material emphasis to draw from. From an individualistic point of view, this means we decide who we want to be. However, this dismisses the importance of communal identity and can pave the way towards narcissistic thinking. We care less about what other people think, while at the same time caring what other people think about what we think. Some ignore thinking about themselves at all. A former client of mine, Jenna, said to me, "I'm ready to dig a bit deeper, but I'm scared of what might come out." In her case, increasing self-awareness would have likely ended in relapse as it brought about memories of guilt and shame. In fact, as a side note, Jordan Peterson, the clinical psychologist, discusses how self-awareness is indistinguishable for many individuals, indistinguishable to negative emotion, so trait negative emotion or neuroticism, because it does bring up such a huge impact on our emotional life when we start to focus inwards. So let's go back to the book, thinking about Jenna and how her fear of digging a bit deeper was so manifest. In her case, increasing self-awareness would have likely ended in relapse as it brought about memories of guilt and shame. While these experiences can help a person, they must be handled with care. After all, you wouldn't send a soldier into war with only their undies and a water pistol. I'm being facetious there, but we catch the guilt. We need to catch the guilt, catch the point. We really need to fortify ourselves in these situations. Like in therapy, they must be prepared and well clad with defensive and offensive resources. For Jenna, teaching emotion regulation was the resource she needed to build before moving forward. You must match your behavior to your values if you want to succeed in regulating yourself. If you can't do this, you'll feel guilt, anger, and satisfaction. Once you promote yourself, build your capacity to trust your abilities, you're more likely to bring your actual self in line with your ideal self. People who drink already have less self-regulatory abilities, given that alcohol impairs areas of the brain such as the anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in the exercise of self-control. Alcohol also reduces glucose distribution around the cortex, leading to difficulties in the exercise of self-awareness, which is a process located in part within the middle prefrontal cortex, and ultimately deficits in self-regulation. We're talking about alcohol here, but a lot of this sort of stuff we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about substance use and the impact of substance use on our various brain regions. Let's go back to alcohol. The more a person tries to quit alcohol, the harder it becomes because that action itself consumes energy. It takes a while for the brain to recover once alcohol is detoxed, with most relapse happening within the first 90 days of quitting. That's the first 3 months. However, as time wears on, cravings decrease in strength and frequency, leading to higher levels of success. Let's relate that back to self-regulation. We need to know what we're dealing with so that we can know what to do. Muscling it out. Willpower is like a muscle. The harder you work, the stronger it gets. This concept is important for those struggling with addiction. The more you think things are beyond your control, the more likely you are to quit trying. The harder you work, the more competent you become. Let's consider willpower in relation to quitting smoking. The late Australian addictions expert and GP Raymond Seidler said, "What smokers don't realize is that nicotine addiction is as powerful or even more powerful than heroin addiction. The brain's receptors for smoking are as strongly attached to nicotine as the heroin receptor is to opiates." In my line of work, most people smoke cigarettes alongside their other drug of choice, even though this significantly increases lethality. Also, once they cease their drug of choice, they keep smoking cigarettes. It is a difficult substance to wash your hands of. Personally, it took me 13 attempts to finally quit smoking. Here's a really funny anecdote. I remember being in a lunchroom and discussing quitting smoking with one of my colleagues at the time, a number of years ago, and she mentioned that it actually takes a person with a brain disorder, a acquired brain injury, that amount of times to quit smoking. So it seems that myself, not having ever experienced a brain injury, took just as many times to quit smoking as somebody with a brain injury. It can happen to all of us, and it's a very difficult substance to, give up. Let's go back to the book. Addiction website The Fix lists 10 of the hardest drugs to kick by order of dependence. Heroin comes in first, with about 1 in 4 people who try the drug becoming dependent. Let's pause it just for a moment, because these are relatively older findings, pre-2017. If we go back to 2023 at this point, I would say that methamphetamine these days seems to be very, very difficult, even lasting years and years and years into a particular habit. And once a person gives that particular habit up, I've actually seen more and more individuals struggle with methamphetamine addiction than with heroin addiction in terms of keeping that abstinence going. So that's just an important side note to consider. Let's go back to the book. Cocaine is second in terms of addictiveness, and cigarettes are a close third. I have seen infinitely more hooked on cigarettes and heroin than cocaine. So it's no surprise that when it comes to dependence, there's an almost 1-to-1 ratio when comparing smokes to the needle. That said, more and more people quit smoking in Australia each year, as each year passes. This makes me think that if it can be done with this substance, quitting invariably requires self-control. From a clinical perspective, this usually encompasses the person writing down their reasons for quitting, evaluating pros and cons, seeking support, changing their diet, exercising more, planning for risky situations, and the list goes on. In fact, the social psychologist Mark Muravan found in the lab people who practiced self-control actually did better at managing lapses. Interestingly, according to Muravan, no addiction treatment program makes use of the important principle of exercising self-control in smoking cessation, even though those exercising self-control through specific tasks that focus on perseverance through stress perform better than those who did not. For Muravan, practicing any task that requires self-control should lead to general improvements in self-control performance. In studying the use of self-control in relation to cigarette smoking, Muravan found that those practicing unrelated self-control tasks had a greater chance of quitting smoking than those who did not practice these exercises. In fact, they were about 3 times more likely to quit. Also, they were more than twice as likely, 27% compared to 12%, of remaining abstinent than those who hadn't practiced self-control tasks beforehand. Self-control tasks include, for example, using your alternate hand, left hand if you're right-handed, to do everyday tasks like moving the cursor on your computer or laptop, correcting your posture when slouching, and focusing on your in and out breath when you're anxious. These exercises activate your prefrontal cortex, allowing you to attend your focus on a particular task. The more tasks like these are carried out, the more myelination occurs within the middle prefrontal region of the cerebral cortex. The more you do something, the better you get because your brain is more connected, shoots off faster messages from cell to cell, and is conditioned to make the task easier. People do things that require self-control every single day without needing to reason themselves into it. Getting up as soon as your alarm goes off in the morning requires willpower, as does holding your tongue when somebody pisses you off. Flossing your teeth requires the same thing. The more these are practiced, the more your body acclimates. In sessions, I often talk about the discipline of one is better than none. One push-up is better than no push-ups. One glass of water is better than none. $1 is better than no dollars. You get the point. What I find when I emphasize this is that people don't usually stop at one. Because doing something once is relatively simple, they create a sense of mastery and are more likely to take another step forward. The same is the case in practicing willpower. One is always better than none. Mervin's studies highlight the exact concept I'm talking about. Self-control is paramount for recovery from substance use. He uses hand grip exercises 2 weeks prior to a person's attempt to quit smoking, and it worked. What are you going to use? Food and addiction. Glucose intake and distribution affect energy levels in the body. Thus, your diet is instrumental in the exercise of willpower. What you put in, as the saying goes, determines what you get out. Self-control is dependent in part on your dietary intake. I'm no dietitian. I can't tell you what to eat and what not to do. In fact, I've seen people who consume all sorts of different foods thrive. Plus, it's not within my area of competence or even time allocation within sessions to help my clients refine a dietary regimen. However, it would be remiss of me to say something to the effect of there is no importance of diet on mental health or addiction or any such thing that requires willpower and discipline. When studying clinical treatments for disorders such as bipolar 1, I was struck at how dietary consumption affected mood, both positively and negatively. The same with depression and anxiety. The more hyper-processed and carb-heavy foods a person eats, generally foods that give you a burst of energy that is often paired with a come down, the worse your mental health outcome. Cleaner, more wholesome foods, top heavy in fats, proteins, and fibers, your daily dose of macro and micronutrients, tend to give people better mental health outcomes. Baumeister and Tierney's book have a section dedicated to food. Organizations that focus on mental health publish client researches noting the importance. Entire books have been published in that vein. I'd like to build on these. First, let's consider a food's GI, glycemic index. This measure describes how quickly a particular food provides glucose to the body for energy. It is essentially a number attributed to a food, often found on packaging or can be found quite quickly online, that designates how long the energy from that food stays in the system. Foods with a high GI give you instant energy. There's a quick spike in blood glucose levels after intake, followed by a plummet after about an hour. Foods with a low GI have a lower blood glucose absorption rate, and even after about 2 hours, give you sustained energy release. Low GI foods are the best choice if you want to achieve a slow and sustained energy release. These foods include meat and organs, including fish, sweet potatoes, whole meals, fruit and some vegetables, raw dairy, berries, that sort of stuff. High GI foods give you an energy release that is quickly depleted in the bloodstream. These foods include white breads, most processed foods, junk foods, many breakfast cereals, milk, chocolate, pasta. In essence, the less processed the food is, the better it is for brain energy. The better the food going into your body, the more sustained the energy you'll have to tackle your self-control needs. Diet is extremely important, as is physical exercise and sleep. These are the bedrocks of healthy functioning. A bit of a side note, sleep more and more has been identified over the research and over the time and the neuroscience that we have about this particular habit that we all must get in get into, really, essentially. Sleep is the most important to sustain us for the next day and for the mood that we have and our ability to tackle that next day. The neuroscientist Andrew Huberman has a lot to say on sleep, including a sleep toolkit. So that's something that you might want to look into. Huberman Lab podcast on sleep will be a very important side note for this one. Let's go back to the book. In therapy, I often discuss these terms with my clients when in mental distress. I found that once these basics are attended to, the outcomes improve. Sleep and rest, in particular, tend to improve the body's overall ability to make use of the glucose in the bloodstream. If you're sleep deprived, tired, stressed, or emotionally drained, you're more likely to give in to pressure. In fact, deprivation has been shown to impair the processing of glucose, which produces immediate consequences for self-control and, over the long term, a higher risk in diabetes. One of my clients, Anthony, came to see me to address drink driving charges. From the outset, he said he was only attending as part of his court requirement, but that he was open to learning. A few minutes into the second session, he told me that he got only 4 hours of sleep the night before. I noticed his eyes droop a few times in the session, and after a few minutes, get heavier and heavier to the point where they actually closed when there were a few silences in the session. He would come to after a few seconds and continue the conversation. After a few sessions, he came in with the same story. I always get tired when I'm not working and have a moment to sit down. It was in this session, mid through one of his own sentences, that his eyes closed, his voice lowered to a mumble, his head fell forward, and he began to snore loudly out of stuffy nostrils. I sat there patiently, looking at the clock, and then back to Anthony. He came to about 4 minutes later. "What happened?" he said. "You were out for about 4 minutes," I said. "Really?" I nodded. "Tell me, where were you?" I was with my dogs. They were in the car. Then I closed the door." Anthony was in a dream state, rapid eye movement or REM sleep. It is a normal stage of sleep that occurs at night, or if during the day, when a person is significantly sleep deprived. It serves as a kind of brain reset that helps the body recover from the day's activity. I closed the session by handing him a sleep hygiene tip sheet I put together and encouraged him to get more rest. Is willpower enough? The addiction psychologist Arnold Washington and therapist Donna Boundy wrote a book in 1990, Willpower is Not Enough, Recovering from Addictions of Every Kind. For them, willpower is never enough. It is not self-control, but self-acceptance that helps. Okay, I agree, in part. Self-acceptance is important, in a way, depending on what you are actually accepting. But self-acceptance of what? These clinicians consider addiction a disease, and therefore acceptance that one has a disease would be paramount. I've argued that the addiction as disease model is not universally accepted, even within the addiction literature, to say nothing of the therapeutic world. And in my experience, I think it's actually counterintuitive to think that one has a disease and it actually inhibits a person's growth. There's no denying, however, that addiction does impact the brain. But when we compare addiction to actual diseases, actual brain diseases, we observe a massive difference. Washington and Boundy are right to say that in today's culture it might be, quote, impossible to grow up and not acquire at least some vulnerability to addiction, close quote. A vulnerability that seems to be internalized through your surroundings, values, norms, beliefs, and so on. In the US, when some states chose to legalize marijuana, many believed, especially in the younger demographic, that it was safer to use. We know this is not the case for everybody. Washington and Boundy are also spot on in saying that as more of us begin rejecting addictive solutions to our problems, we begin to create a healthier culture in our society. This, I think, is done through self-awareness, at least at the beginning. And through self-awareness comes self-control. I want to end that chapter there. Self-awareness predates and precipitates self-control, which allows a person to have that more control over their addiction. Let's look at the chapter summary. The amount of willpower energy that you have is affected by the type of drug you consume. Your depletion hits the more you use self-control for a particular task. The more you practice self-control, the stronger your ability gets. Self-awareness is pivotal for self-regulation. The more you understand yourself and your surroundings, the better you can regulate your behavior. The practicalities: commit to understanding yourself, asking questions, seeking different points of view, and being open to discomfort along the way. Remind yourself that the more you understand your triggers, the more control you have around your destructive habits. Watch what you eat. Practice, practice, practice. The more you practice self-control, the stronger you become. Thank you for listening in to today's episode of the Emil Barna podcast, where I've presented my next chapter in my Willpower book, Discipline. Looking forward to joining you into the next episode. And just remember, this book is coming on as a hard copy very shortly, soft cover rather. And what I want to also present to you guys, if you guys are interested, I do have a new novel that is called A Killer's Guide, available directly through me. If you reach out into my website and we can make a purchase there, I can send that through to you, or you can purchase it on Amazon and get that shipped to wherever you are. You can have it on ebook as well as soft cover, paperback. That's the one that I'm searching for, paperback, as well as another book that I've written, not a novel, but one on tapping for trauma, which goes through a particular therapy that I've adapted and found very useful along the way to help people through their traumatic experiences. I'll leave that for now. Keep an eye on the podcast, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It really does help us out, given I manage everything here by myself. I don't have a team of people that work with me. It's a matter of doing everything at this moment in 2023 by myself and as a passion project. So see you on the other side.